Do you think that the lieutenant governor was operating outside of the purview of Governor Walz?
So it's interesting, the timing, and it was before he ran as the vice president, and so she was completely almost tied at the hip with Governor Walz at that time in history.
Folks, what you just heard is deeply alarming. And the truth is, it only gets more serious from here. We're not talking about abstract policy debates or political talking points. We're talking about American taxpayer money. Your money, my money. Leaving Minnesota under fraudulent programs and potentially ending up in the worst possible hands. Today's exchange features Representative Byron Donalds of Florida, and he doesn't hold back. He presses hard on the failures inside Minnesota state leadership, zeroing in on Governor Tim Walz's administration. What comes out is a disturbing picture: widespread fraud, intimidation of whistleblowers, and a level of dysfunction that goes far beyond simple mismanagement. Now, let's be clear about the stakes. This isn't happening in some distant bureaucracy. This is Minnesota, right in the political orbit of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. When you look at the scope of what Donalds exposes, it starts to explain why the system there appears so broken. Money wasn't just lost. The people who tried to stop the theft were reportedly ignored, sidelined, or pushed out. That's not just failure. That's institutional decay. What sets Byron Donalds apart in this moment is that he isn't chasing headlines. He's asking direct questions that demand real answers. He's pressing officials on why warnings were dismissed, why oversight collapsed, and why accountability seemed to disappear when it mattered most. And the responses he gets during this hearing should concern every American who expects their government to safeguard public funds that we're about to watch the full clip together. Afterward, I'll break down exactly how this situation was allowed to spiral, what it reveals about leadership in Minnesota, and why it has implications far beyond one state. This isn't just about the past. It's about what happens when systems fail and no one is held responsible. Stay with me for the full breakdown. This is one you don't want to miss. Let's roll the tape.
Before we begin, I have a letter to submit for the record titled Collective Request for Congressional Oversight, Systematic Retaliation and Governance Failure at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Chairman, this letter was written by the whistleblowers and has been provided to the committee. I want to submit that for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Rarick, first of all, thank you for your service to the state of Minnesota. I want to refer back to your commentary about a meeting where the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Minnesota, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, came and admonished these whistleblowers. Can you go into more detail about what was said in this meeting?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. So I don't have any more detail other than what I read into the record. Unfortunately, it was obviously a public meeting, and there were hundreds of DHS employees, so Department of Human Services employees there. It was a story that's been reported multiple times on the X page, but I don't have any more details than that, other than the fact that that wasn't the only time that she retaliated.
Do you think that the Lieutenant Governor was operating outside of the purview of Governor Walz?
So it's interesting, the timing, and it was before he ran as the vice president, and so she was completely almost tied at the hip with Governor Walz at that time in history.
I think it's important for people to understand that in virtually every state in the country, the lieutenant governor is essentially chosen by the governor. And so lieutenant governors typically do not operate outside of the purview of the governor. It's kind of their job to, play QB2, if you will, to the governor. So would it be clear to state that the lieutenant governor's comments trying to railroad whistleblowers, trying to demean whistleblowers and discourage whistleblowers was at the directive of Governor Walz?
You can definitely assume that because, like I said, at that moment in time, up until the point where the governor ran for VP, she was seen at literally every press conference. She was in all the meetings. They were tied at the hip. They were always together. So if she was saying it, he had approved it. I'm certain of it.
Well, I guess you could say she's kind of a knucklehead too. Moving on, the list of programs in the fraud in Minnesota are rampant. You have the Child Care Assistance Program. You have the Feeding Our Future. You have the housing housing stabilization services. You have the early intensive development and behavioral intervention. You have integrated community supports. Ms. Robbins, you're the chair of the investigative committee. The depth of fraud that you have seen, were there controls in place in the state of Minnesota that could have prevented this fraud? And were these controls ignored by the Walz administration and by the Department of Human Services?
Absolutely. So we have many whistleblower reports talking about how DHS undermined ability to strengthen internal controls. So, for example, there was an effort for the Child Care Assistance Program. They have a clear and convincing evidence standard to disqualify someone from being a provider, where all the other programs are a lower standard, preponderance of the evidence. There was an effort to make this a lower standard so it was easier to disqualify people to preponderance, and the Minnesota Minority Child Care Association, which was run by a group of Somali providers, opposed it, and DHS went along with their recommendation. And in a similar vein, we were trying to reduce the number of child care employees with children that could work in these child care centers, because that was one of the vectors of fraud. Right. And they opposed that.
So you had the Somali community who on purpose was petitioning the state of Minnesota to lower the standards to be able to make sure that fraud cannot be caught. Is that correct?
Well, they wanted to keep the standard clear and convincing, which makes it harder to disqualify people.
So it makes it harder for them to be disqualified from wasting taxpayer funds. Is that
Absolutely.
correct? Okay. Ms. Robbins, I want to stay with you. I want to talk about use of funds. You've talked about some of these funds were used to buy property in Kenya.
Yes, sir.
Property in Turkey. Do I have that correct?
Yes.
Remittances back to Somalia?
Yes.
I think it's important for the committee to understand that these remittances in part are used in what's called the Hawala. I want to make sure I have the terminology right. The Hawala network. Ms. Robbins, can you speak to what the Hawala network is?
Yes. So it's an informal network where someone goes to a Hawala place in Minneapolis, which is like a money exchange or a money sending site, and they say, I want to send X amount of dollars, and then there's a receiving site in Somalia, and they put the cash, take the cash out. So money doesn't cross the border. It's an order for money here that gets transmitted to Somalia.
For the time, because I'm out of time, I want to expound. In Somalia and other parts in the Middle East region writ large, a Hawala network is a bunch of money exchangers, hand to hand, not bank account to bank account.
Exactly.
And what is clear in Somalia and other parts is that Al-Shabaab, the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, they have their hands all through this network. So taxpayer money, United States dollars, that are being remitted into Somalia, in part, have been utilized or have fallen into the hands of Al-Shabaab. Do you think that's a correct assessment?
Yes, we have plenty of evidence of that, from money directly going to Al-Shabaab, but then also indirectly because they take a cut of whatever gets sent to Somalia.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I know I'm over. Thank you for the addition.
Unbelievable. That's really the only word for what we just witnessed. There is a lot of information packed into that exchange, and every single detail raises serious questions for Governor Tim Walz's administration and the political leadership in Minnesota. Let's slow this down and walk through it carefully, because Representative Byron Donalds methodically exposed a chain of failures that cannot be brushed aside. First, Donalds focused on a meeting involving Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. According to the testimony, Flanagan and Governor Walz operate as a unified leadership team. Their decisions and messaging are closely aligned. That context matters, because what happened next is deeply troubling. That we learned that the lieutenant governor addressed a large group of state employees and, rather than encouraging transparency, reportedly reprimanded those who had raised concerns about fraud. These were individuals attempting to alert leadership that taxpayer money was being misused. Instead of addressing the allegations, leadership responded in a way that discouraged further reporting. That is not how responsible oversight works. When people trying to protect public funds feel pressured or silenced, accountability collapses. From there, Donalds shifted to the fraud itself, and this is where the testimony becomes even more alarming. Investigator Ms. Robbins confirmed that Minnesota's Department of Human Services actively interfered with efforts to remove fraudulent providers from government programs. Rather than strengthening enforcement, the agency considered lowering the evidentiary threshold required to suspend or remove bad actors. Why would that happen? According to the testimony, certain provider groups objected to stricter enforcement. Instead of standing with taxpayers and existing regulations, the state chose accommodation. That decision didn't protect vulnerable communities. It protected fraudulent activity. This is a textbook example of policy decisions being shaped by political pressure rather than by law, ethics, or fiscal responsibility. The most serious concern came next. Donalds traced how stolen funds may have moved beyond state borders entirely. Testimony indicated that money obtained through fraudulent Minnesota programs was used to purchase property overseas and transferred through informal financial networks that are difficult to track. Investigators are examining whether some of these funds may have reached extremist organizations abroad. To be clear, this is not a conclusion. It is an investigation. But the fact that federal authorities consider the possibility credible enough to pursue should alarm every American. Money allocated to feed children and support vulnerable populations should never end up in international criminal or extremist pipelines. The risk alone demands answers. What makes Donalds effective in moments like this is his approach. He doesn't rely on theatrics. He asks precise questions, listens carefully, and lets witnesses speak. The testimony, taken as a whole, paints a picture of leadership that prioritized political comfort over decisive action. Oversight failed not because the warning signs were absent, but because responding to them was considered inconvenient. Governor Walz's administration now faces serious questions. How were warnings handled? Why were whistleblowers discouraged? Why was enforcement weakened instead of strengthened? And how did safeguards fail so badly that taxpayer money may have traveled far beyond its intended purpose? This isn't about party politics. It's about whether public institutions can be trusted to protect public funds and whether leadership is willing to confront uncomfortable truths when doing so carries political risk. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you surprised by what came out of this hearing? And do you believe real accountability will follow? Thanks for watching and stay informed.